a man froze mid-step on a London street, and the woman he abandoned 8 months earlier was standing there, starving, alone, and carrying his child. He didn't recognize her at first. Not really. He recognized the tilt of her chin, the stubborn way she held her shoulders when she was arguing over the price of a rotten vegetable. And then the wind caught her shawl, and he saw the swell beneath it, and the whole world he'd spent a fortune building around himself came crashing down in the middle of a crowded market. This is the story of a duke who thought he had buried his heart 8 months ago, and the freezing November afternoon that proved he was wrong. Theodore Ashdown had a talent for not seeing things. It was, in its own way, a skill he'd spent years perfecting. He didn't see the beggars on the corner of his own street. He didn't see the servants' exhaustion. And for 8 long months, he had trained himself not to see the empty space beside him in bed, the space where his wife used to sleep before she signed her name to a piece of paper and walked out of his life for good. He was 32 years old that November, though most days he felt closer to 80. He was walking arm in arm with his intended bride, a beautiful, well-bred woman named Beatrice Fairfax, through the frozen streets near Covent Garden. Their carriage had been stopped by a spilled coal wagon, and rather than wait in the cold, Theo had decided they would simply walk the rest of the way. It was, without question, the worst decision he ever made, and the best one. Beatrice complained about the mud. She complained about the smell, about the noise, about the desperate press of ordinary people trying to survive a London winter. Theo barely heard her. He'd grown used to tuning out complaints that didn't matter, and hers rarely did. He kept his eyes forward, his jaw locked, walking through the chaos of the market the way a man walks through a room he's trying to forget he's in. And then he saw her. She was arguing with a vegetable seller over a bruised, half-frozen cabbage, her bare hands red and cracked from the cold. Her dress was coarse gray cotton, hemmed with mud. Her dark hair he remembered pinned with pearls, hair his own valet used to arrange, was shoved carelessly under a plain wool bonnet. It was Josephine, his wife, his former wife, technically, though the word had never once felt true in his chest. He hadn't seen her in 8 months. He'd assumed, in the rare moments he allowed himself to think about her at all, that she'd retreated somewhere quiet and comfortable, some cottage in the countryside, living off whatever pride had kept her from accepting the money he'd tried to send. He had sent that money through his solicitor. It had come back unopened. He'd told himself that was pride. He was about to learn how wrong he'd been. As Josephine turned to pay the vendor, the wind pulled her thin shawl back from her body, and Theo stopped breathing entirely. Beneath her apron, her stomach was round and heavy. Unmistakably, undeniably pregnant. His mind did the arithmetic before his heart had a chance to catch up. 8 months since the annulment papers were signed. The night before she signed them, she had been in his bed, in his arms, telling him things he believed with his whole chest. This baby was his. For one long, terrible second, their eyes met across the crowded square. He watched shock flash across her face, watched her hand fly protectively to her stomach, and then watched something colder settle over her features. Not shame, not tears, defiance. She looked at his fine coat, at Beatrice clinging to his arm in fox fur, and something in her expression told him exactly what he looked like to her. A wealthy man parading his new bride while the woman, carrying his child, froze in the street. She turned and walked away before he could say a single word. He called her name. He tore his arm free from Beatrice, ignoring her shriek of protest, and pushed through the crowd, through a herd of sheep being driven to market, through shouting costermongers, through everything London's underbelly could throw in his path. By the time he reached the alley she disappeared into, she was gone, swallowed by the maze of the rookeries. He stood there in the cold, chest heaving, and made a decision that would unmake his entire life. He couldn't simply abandon Beatrice in the middle of Covent Garden. Duty, that suffocating aristocratic instinct, wouldn't allow it. So he put her in a cab back to her family's townhouse, ignoring her tears and her accusations, and returned to the vegetable stand with 2 gold coins and a single question. Where does she live? The answer took him somewhere he never imagined a duke's wife would end up. St. Giles, the worst slum in London. A maze of disease and desperation where, the vendor warned him, a man in a coat like his wouldn't survive the walk without losing his throat along with his buttons. Theo went anyway. He climbed a rotting staircase above a cooper's shop, past a landing where a rat ran over his boot, until he reached a single door hanging crooked on its hinges. When Josephine finally opened it, just a crack, the sight of her up close nearly buckled his knees. Her face was hollow. Dark circles bruised the skin beneath her eyes. She was shaking with cold, and she looked at him not with hope, but with the flat exhaustion of someone who had long since stopped expecting rescue. "Go away, Theodore," she told him. He didn't. He put his boot in the door and told her plainly that he wasn't leaving the hallway, that she could let him in or he'd take the door off its hinges himself. Something in his voice must have convinced her, because she stepped back. The room he walked into was smaller than his dressing closet. Damp walls, a dead, cold fireplace, a narrow bed with a thin, threadbare quilt. This was where his wife had been living. This was where she'd been planning to give birth to his child. What came out over the next several minutes broke something open in him that he didn't know was still capable of feeling. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, had gone to Josephine the very day the scandal about her father's alleged embezzlement broke, before Theo had even returned for Parliament. She'd laid forged naval ledgers on the desk, documents that implicated not just Josephine's father, but Theo himself as a silent accomplice. She told Josephine there was only one way to make the threat disappear: sign the annulment, confess to a marriage that had never truly existed, and vanish. Refuse, and those ledgers would go straight to the crown, destroying her father and dragging Theo down with him. Josephine had signed to protect the man she loved, and then she had disappeared into poverty rather than take a single shilling from an estate controlled by a woman who had made it clear she'd destroy an entire family without blinking. The pension Theo had tried to send? Intercepted. Watched. She'd sold the last of her jewelry just to pay a midwife in advance, rather than risk showing up anywhere near the Ashdown name. Theo knelt in front of her, and when she gasped and pressed a hand to her stomach, he froze in terror, until she told him it was only the baby kicking, that he didn't seem to like the cold, or perhaps he didn't like Theo raising his voice. Theo reached out, hesitant, and she let him rest his hand over hers. He felt it then, a small, sharp thump against his palm. His son, alive, fighting, real. He wept without shame for the first time in longer than he could remember. "I'm going to kill her," he whispered, meaning his mother, and he meant every syllable. What followed wasn't rage, it was precision. Theo wrapped Josephine in his own coat, carried her out of that freezing room, and installed her not at the grand family estate, where his mother's spies would find her within hours, but at a quiet, discreet townhouse he'd inherited and rarely used. He summoned a doctor. He posted his most loyal servant at the door with strict instructions. No one enters, not for any reason, not even for a royal seal. Then he went to end his mother's reign. He walked into a dinner party celebrating his own betrothal to Beatrice, still in the mud-splattered clothes he'd worn into the slums, and announced, in front of 10 of London's most powerful families, that his engagement was over because he was already married, and he had just spent the afternoon pulling his real wife and his unborn son out of the very poverty his own mother had forced them into. The Dowager Duchess didn't deny it. She threatened him instead, quietly, so only he could hear, "Bring that girl back," and the forged ledgers go straight to the magistrate. Theo's answer was ice. "Take them," he told her, and by morning, every account bearing her name would be frozen. Every carriage sold, every servant dismissed. She would spend the rest of her life in the smallest, coldest house the family owned, and he would make certain of it personally. For the first time in his life, he watched real fear cross his mother's face. But threats alone wouldn't save Josephine's father from the gallows. The forged evidence still existed, and someone still held the pen that had created it. So Theo spent the following hours moving through a London most dukes never set foot in. He cornered a ruined nobleman deep in gambling debt and traded forgiveness of that debt for a single name, the forger his mother had hired. He tracked that man to a filthy print shop in Spitalfields, cornered him among stacks of stolen paper, and offered him a choice: a small fortune, and a ship to America that very night, or a public confession to the Bow Street authorities and a noose. The forger chose the money. He handed over the original letters used to fake the handwriting, the practice sheets, and a signed confession naming exactly who had paid for the crime. By the time Theo returned to the family estate, his mother was already packing. He didn't gloat. He simply held up the confession long enough for her to read it and watch every ounce of her power drain away. Yorkshire, he told her. Alone. Forever. If she ever spoke his wife's name again, that confession would be printed for all of London to read. She left without another word. The months that followed weren't a fairy tale. Rebuilding trust after 8 months of abandonment and starvation doesn't happen overnight, no matter how many fires you light or how many doctors you hire. Josephine hoarded bread in her pockets some nights, terrified on some animal level that the hunger would return. Theo never mentioned it. He simply made sure there was always more than enough, quietly, without ceremony, until her body finally believed what her mind couldn't yet accept. He gave up his own bed to sleep on a settee in her room, refusing to be anywhere but close enough to hear her breathing. He read to her by the fire. He placed his hand on her stomach every night that she allowed it, feeling his son grow stronger week by week, proof that something good had survived the wreckage. The birth, when it finally came during a violent spring storm, nearly broke him in an entirely different way. He stayed by her side the whole 10 hours, discarding every rule of polite society that said a man belonged in another room with a glass of brandy, while his wife suffered alone. He held her hand until she drew blood without loosening his grip. He pressed his forehead to hers and told her she had survived worse than this. She had survived the streets, survived his mother, survived being utterly alone with nothing but her own will to keep her upright. And then, as gray dawn broke through the storm clouds, a furious, healthy cry filled the room. Asson, loud, red-faced, and absolutely, unmistakably theirs. Theo held them both, his wife and his boy, and felt the last cold, cynical piece of himself finally give way to something he'd been too proud to admit he wanted all along, a family that was his chosen and fought for, rather than arranged and inherited. He hadn't just found his wife again that freezing afternoon in Covent Garden. He'd found out exactly what kind of man he wanted to be, and it wasn't the one who'd let her walk out the door 8 months before. So here's the question worth sitting with. How many of us have let pride win a battle that our heart was quietly losing? How many people do we let walk away, telling ourselves it's easier than fighting? Theodore Ashdown got a second chance most people never do. What he did with it is what actually made him worthy of the title he was born into. If this story moved you, let me know down in the comments. I always want to know which part hit hardest. And if you'd like more stories like this one, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to fight for the people who matter.